Hey everyone, it is Chris. I've been talking about damage for the last few months. And in the 2024 Player's Handbook, we have tons of new player options. And so I was kind of exploring to see what the damage potential was of the various options. And I've done many builds. And I've done damage per round calculations for them from levels 1 through 20. And I did one video where I kind of did some generalizations regarding the data, and then I narrowed in on tier 1, which is levels 1 through 4, then tier 2, which are levels 5 through 10, and now we're going to look at levels 11 through 16, which is tier 3. What you should see up on your screen right now are tier 3 ranks, and you're going to see they go from D to A, representing different amounts of damage. 26 is the lowest that I got, and 57 is the highest that I got. Now, in the last tier of play, in tier 2, we saw that a berserker with a great sword did the most damage, but now we're going to have other classes showing a little bit more oomph in tier 3, like fighters are getting a third attack, and paladins are adding d8s on all their damage. So we'll see how that has changed in tier 3. And I'm going to give you kind of a class ranking at the end of this as well. But what I want to do is look at various types of character you can make and see what the damage is like. Now, what I have been doing is I've been comparing base builds, which are builds that do not use a subclass, and then optimized builds that do use a subclass. Now, one thing we should keep in mind is that with a lot of subclasses, the higher level you get, the more damage they add. So the bigger the difference there will be from base builds and optimized builds. And we should keep this in mind, because if we are going to play a class and then not take a subclass that increases damage, which we can pretty much do with any class. Fighter pretty much adds damage regardless of what subclass you choose, but most classes have subclass options that do not increase your damage. We're going to see that the difference between them and builds where we use subclasses that do add damage have increased. So we're going to see more red ranks amongst the base builds and fewer red ranks amongst the optimized builds. The final thing I want to mention here before we get going is that I am pushing for 100,000 subscribers. I think I can make it before the end of this year. I am very close. Every time I mention this, I'm getting a few people to subscribe, so I'm going to ask again, if you are not subscribed to this channel, consider subscribing right now. But what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a guide as to if you are playing in Tier 3 or playing in a campaign that will eventually get to Tier 3, what you can expect for damage from various types of character and various classes of character. So we are going to begin with base two-handed melee builds. So these are builds that do not utilize a subclass, but they use both hands to attack. So it could be a two-handed sword, it could be two-weapon fighting, okay? And we're going to start at the bottom end. The worst one I had, the Ranger Base Hunter's Mark II Weapon Fighter at 28. That puts it in D tier. This was one of the top damage dealers in Tier 1, and look what's happened in Tier 3. Rangers just don't add a lot of damage in Tier 3. Now, the difference in damage from Tier 1 to Tier 2 is dramatic. It's almost triple. But the difference from Tier 2 to Tier 3 is far more subtle. It's more like 50%. Rangers, however, do not get anywhere near 50% in Tier 3. They don't get a lot at all. In fact, do you know what the Ranger Base Hunter's Mark II Weapon Fighter did in Tier 2? 26. So we're talking about 2 points of damage for being in Tier 3. That's really not good. And this is unfortunately the way it is with Rangers. I never found a method to make Rangers really jump up in Tier 3. They tend to be fairly level with Tier 2 damage. And that's why our next build is the Ranger Base Phase Summoner two-weapon fighting. So if we replace Hunter's Mark with Summon Fae instead to try to increase our damage, we get 1 point of damage. And it's still in D tier. So there just doesn't seem to be a way that I have found to get a jump in tier 3 with the Ranger, it just is kind of flat, which is really unfortunate. But that's the way it is. Let's go on to RC ranks. So we're going to have the Warlock base Blade Pack Greatsword, does 37. That is a big jump. So the Face Summoner was at 29. We're all the way up to 37 just by changing classes. So yeah, if you want to play a Warlock with a Greatsword, your damage is okay in tier 3. Then we are going to have a 3-way tie. So we have the Monk. This is a monk that has 2 daggers, and they take the weapon mastery feat so that they can get the Nick property, so they get even another attack to go on top of all their flurry of blows attacks, and put all those together, and you're going to get 38 points of damage on average in tier 3. Paladin base greatsword. So this is just a paladin. Grab a greatsword, 38 points of damage, not too bad. And a barbarian with a greatsword, 38 points of damage. These, again, are not huge damage numbers. None of these are doing a lot of damage, but they're all doing okay damage. So if you want to play any of these and you want to still feel like you're contributing to damage, you will be. The best you can do, though, with the base classes in two-handed melee, and the best you can do with base classes at all, is the fighter. So the fighter gets a big boost from tier 2 to tier 3, and they're really the only class that gets this kind of boost. The fighter base greatsword actually did only 26 points of damage in tier 2. We're all the way up to 47 in tier 3. Big boost in tier 3 for fighters. And fighters get a lot in tier 3. It's not just about damage. They're also getting indomitable, and it's scaling. And yeah, fighters do really nicely in tier 3, regardless of what subclass you choose. Let's talk about one-handed melee. So in this case, we're looking at characters that might use a shield. With base classes, we're just not going to get there. You really need to be thinking about your subclass in order to get these going, because I've got 2 D builds here. I've got the Warlock base True Strike Shillelagh. So this is a Warlock. They use True Strike, Shillelagh, and Agonizing Blast, and it just doesn't do damage. It's 26. This is my lowest damage in tier 3. So the absolute worst build possible of all the ones that I did was the Warlock with the Shillelagh and True Strike. Better than that, but still pretty bad, is the fighter base longsword. And I talked a little bit in my last video why I figure fighters and longswords just don't work well together. And yeah, once again, we see it's not doing well in tier 3, even though fighters do well in tier 3. You just probably want to look at a different weapon. If I was to make a fighter with one-handed melee and I wanted to do better damage, I'd be looking at maybe something like a rapier. Or maybe something like Shillelagh might work as well. But the base longsword, yeah, 31 isn't enough in tier 3 in my opinion. So now let's look at the range combat options. And if we're talking about base builds, we're not going to do a ton of damage regardless of our choice, but there's some things we definitely shouldn't do. There's a tie for last place, and it is only one higher than the lowest, which was the True Strike Shillelagh. We have bards relying on spells to deal damage, and warlocks using Eldritch Blast to deal damage. 27 points of damage around in tier 3. That's not enough damage. If damage is what you're trying to do, this just does not cut it. Only slightly better than those two. The Ranger with a longbow and Hunter's Mark, only 28, and still well into D tier. And then a little bit better, the Druid base spells build at 30. This one is going to use Conjure Animals and Conjure Fae, and they're just not going to do enough damage to be really relevant in combat. Then we get into the ones that are doing okay. And we have the Rogue base Dagger Thrower. This wasn't even intended to be an optimized build. It was just a really, really intuitive build of a rogue that has 2 daggers and they throw them. Now, that's not a lot of range, but you get 34 points of damage around. You will do more damage if instead of throwing daggers, you get True Strike and get a light crossbow. Then you're going to go up to 38 points of damage around. But you can beat either of these in ranged because one of the builds that is coming online that wasn't very strong in Tier 2, but now it's getting to be pretty good, is the Sorcerer-based Blast spells. And this is because of innate sorcery, giving you advantage on attacks. So this character uses Bigby's Hand, primarily, to deal damage, and Scorching Rays, and can get up to 40 points of damage a round. That's not high damage in Tier 3, but being that the highest damage we're going to get is 57, this isn't that far behind, but this does put us in C tier for damage, but at near the top of C tier. Now let's talk about our optimized options. So if we're going to talk two-handed melee, we're going to get the highest damage numbers possible. These are all not bad, and a lot of them are really good. So we're going to start with the tie, and these are the only C tiers in two-handed melee. Everything else is better than this. But these still do okay damage. We have the College of Valor Greatsword. This uses True Strike with the College of Valor special extra attack that lets you use a cantrip. And the Fey Wanderer Summoner 2-weapon fighter. And this is about as good as you're going to get for a Ranger in Tier 3. Okay, I should add some context here. I should mention that the College of Valor Greatsword build that I am showing the damage for here uses True Strike as part of their extra attack, and then uses mainly Summon Celestial to increase damage. So we're casting a summon spell, and then we're attacking with the Greatsword using True Strike. If you use Conjure Minor Elementals, I did the math for that in my Bard video, we actually end up closer to 80 points of damage, and it's way above everything else, because Conjure Minor Elementals, if you upcast it, it goes crazy. And so it ends up being not anywhere close to anything else, and by far does the most damage. And that is because Conjure Minor Elementals has a problem with upcasting. It upcasts far too aggressively. So I did a build without using that to see what it would happen in what I would imagine is going to be most tables, where the DM is going to very wisely either nerf the spell or ban it outright. And so keep in mind that if you're using Conjure Minor Elementals as written, then that's absolutely what you should do, because it is by far going to outdamage everything else. Okay, so I wanted to add that context. Take a Fey Wanderer, focus on Summon Fey, and you do, okay damage, 35. Now, both of these are well below other optimized two-handed builds, so just be aware that Bards and Rangers just aren't it for damage in Tier 3. So we are now going to jump a lot. So we'll go from 35 all the way up to 44, and B tier with the Circle of the Moon Druid. So Circle of the Moon Druid uses Conjure Animals in combination with Wild Shape and Wild Shape attacks, and does pretty good damage. 44, nothing wrong with that. But we're going to get a lot higher than 44 for two-handed melee. This isn't nearly the top damage we can do with this style of character. We're then going to go to Warlock, Fiend Patron Greatsword focused on Charisma, 48 points of damage, and that is tied with the Zealot with a Greatsword, 48 points of damage. So these are both doing pretty strong damage for the level, but not still nowhere near the top. We're going to go next to the Fiend Patron Greatsword that focused on Strength. They only get 1 additional point of damage. I don't think that's worth it. I would probably go with Charisma. But technically speaking, you will do a little bit more damage with a Fiend Patron Warlock that focuses on Strength rather than Charisma. And tied with them is the Eldritch Knight Greatsword. So once again, True Strike and Greatsword, extra attack all going together. 49 points of damage. This is lower than other fighter builds I did, simply because I did a video on this. I think that the damage potential of Eldritch Knights has been overstated if we're only using the player's handbook. If we are using older material and Booming Blade is allowed, that might be different. I don't think they would be more than other fighter classes, but they would be at least in the same category. But we will go up to A tier with the next fighter build, which is just a Psi Warrior using a Greatsword. And we just use, that psionic strike to do a little bit of extra damage once in a while. That gets us up to 53. It does add up. You get a fair number of uses of that feature. And then above them, just by 1 point, the Warrior of Shadow 2-weapon fighter. So this is a monk, and we got a tier in tier 3 with 54 points of damage. And then we're going to go into the paladins. We got 2 paladins. They are both tied. And this is the Oath of Vengeance Greatsword and the Oath of Vengeance Dex 2-weapon fighter. And I think this is interesting because I was actually convinced to do the Oath of Vengeance Dex 2-weapon fighting build. I was actually going to look at a Warlock dip and focus on Charisma instead, but viewer request was to look at Paladins with 2-weapon fighting, specifically because at level 11 they can get extra attacks to deliver more of those D8s. And we do see the Dex 2-weapon fighter do significantly better than the Oath of Vengeance Greatsword at level 11. But they lose that increase very quickly, and then by the end of tier 3, you're just doing more damage with the Greatsword, and so they kind of even out. And we ended up with the same average at 56. The highest damage is 57, so this is very close to top of the, if you want to do a ton of damage in tier 3, Paladin is a great choice. And look at Oath of Vengeance and look at Oath of Devotion, because they will increase your damage significantly in this tier. Beating them both out by 1 point is the Berserker with the Greatsword. Yes, the Berserker is still on top in tier 3, ahead of the fighters. Despite the extra attack you get at level 11, Berserker's just adding so much damage that they still hold the lead, but that lead has shrunk. And now we're going to talk about one-handed melee. So if you want to have a hand free for grappling or using a shield or whatever, these are what you would want to consider. And we have a fair amount of a gap between the bottom and the top here. At the very bottom, the Battle Master using a longsword, fighters and longswords, same issue. We're still in C tier, so the damage isn't terrible, but this is low for this category. Just a little bit better than them is the Zealot with a longsword. So yeah, the Zealot actually does really well with a longsword in tier 2, but they do not get a big boost in tier 3. If I am to reference my tier 2 numbers here, just give me a moment. Let's see, I probably should have memorized this, but okay, so the Zealot with a longsword in tier 2 did 30. So we are really only talking about 7 points of damage as an increase for tier 3. It's not nothing, but yeah, we're not near the top of the damage for one-handed builds. Now we're going to get into good damage for one-handed builds. The first is the Celestial Patron True Strike Shillelagh. Yes, finally, it came online. So True Strike Shillelagh with a Warlock without a subclass that's boosting damage is a bad idea. But you want to make one attack around that really does a lot of damage, and you take True Strike and Shillelagh, and then you take Agonizing Blast on the True Strike, and then you're adding your subclass your subclass proficiency bonus to damage, I think it is. It is not your proficiency bonus. The idea of Celestial Patron is that you will be adding your Charisma 3 times to damage. So you add it once for the base attack, you add it once for Agonizing Blast, and you add it once for your subclass, and so you add it 3 times. From Celestial, you just add a lot of damage, and it ends up being not bad at all. 42, decent damage. Then we're going to go to the Oath of Vengeance Longsword. So if you want to play a Paladin with a Longsword, you do good damage in Tier 3. Nothing wrong with that. You can do a little bit more with a Berserker with a Longsword at 45. I think this was maybe the highest damage in Tier 2. Not anymore, but the damage of 45, considering we're using one hand for a weapon that doesn't even have a mastery property that increases damage. It's a defensive property. 45, not bad at all. Very, very doable. Then the Eldritch Knight with a Shillelagh. So if you want to play a fighter and use a one-handed weapon, consider Shillelagh. Topple Mastery really helps out. And the scaling damage of the shillelagh really helps out. So we can get up to 47 points of damage. This is not the highest fighter damage. True Strike doesn't add as much as we might hope. If we want to do the most damage with a fighter and a shillelagh, do the champion. And then you get to 54. This is 3 points shy of the Berserker Greatsword. That was the highest damage using 2 hands at this level. With the champion, we can get pretty close to that using only 1 hand. Then, finally, let's talk about ranged. And we can get decent range damage depending on our subclass selection and, what kind of range character we make. The lowest I have here is C tier, which isn't too bad, and that's the Beastmaster with the longbow. Again, we don't have a lot of great ranger options at this level. The 2-weapon fighter, by the way, the Fey Wanderer, was 35, so we're actually technically above that a little bit. But Beastmaster, I gotta say, there's a lot of bonus action hungry characters there that are going to be using Beastmaster and trying to use Hunter's Mark with it, and finding that, guess what? You don't have as many bonus actions as you think you do. Then we're going to go to 1 higher with the Archfey Patron Eldritch Blast. So we can get Eldritch Blast damage to a decent level, but we need to use our subclass to do so. And then we're going to get into B tier damage, and this is with ranged. So if you want to play ranged and do decent damage, you can, and we have a tie for top damage for ranged, and that is the Draconic Sorcerer Blast build. So this is the same blast build I was talking about before, but you take Draconic Sorcerer, so you can add your Charisma modifier to some of the damage you do, and the Assassin with a heavy crossbow. So we play the Rogue, take a fighter dip, so we can get heavy crossbow, and then we just take Assassin, and that continually adds to damage. It goes up and up and up as you go up in level, and they both do 43, which is not bad at all. In fact, that is higher than we're going to get with a College of Valor Bard with a Greatsword, a fair bit higher. So yeah, you can do decent range damage, but it won't be the highest. The highest damage will be melee. The difference here is 43 to, if we look at the two-handed optimized builds, we go anywhere from 53 to 57 in A tier, and there's 5 different character options there that get you in that range. So 43 is, what, maybe 20% less? And, that's not terrible, right? So we're going to cover the ranks of the various base builds that I did to kind of give you an idea of which classes do the most damage in Tier 3. And I'm not going to do a countdown. They're up on your screen. And we have Fighter with the highest potential in Tier 3. Yes, the Berserker can do more damage, but Barbarians in general do not. So only the Berserker gets to the highest point in Tier 3. The other ones are middling. Fighters, just doesn't matter what you choose. As long as you choose, a two-handed weapon, you're going to do good damage. Behind them at number 2, a fair bit behind, is the Sorcerer in second rank, and that is just using spells to do damage. Innate Sorcery does that for you quite a bit. Then we have a 4-way tie. So 3, 4, 5, and 6 is a tie, and that's what a grouping, right? Like, what a close grouping of damage. Barbarians, monks, paladins, and rogues all do about the same damage in Tier 3 if we're not worrying about subclass. Then Warlock is just a little bit behind at 37, and then we have a huge drop. And 8, 9, and 10 are all like within 2 points. The Druid at 8. Again, if you want to do good damage with a Druid, you can. Just take Circle of the Moon. You'll do good damage, but base Druid does not. Ranger at 29. What a huge drop. Ranger was number 1 in Tier 1. And now they're all the way down to 9th. Just barely ahead of the poor Bard that's been at the back the whole time. A Bard just doesn't do good damage, folks. Doesn't really matter what level you are. And I hate to say this is not going to change in the next video when we look at Tier 4. But there's Tier 3. So if you want to do great damage in Tier 3, I have to say, consider going two-handed melee. That does great damage. And, you can actually choose even a bard and do okay damage with that method, but there are so many good options for doing fantastic damage with paladins, with fighters, with monks, and with barbarians if you choose the right subclass. And yeah, so there's our tier 3 numbers. And in my next video, I will finish this up at last. We'll cover tier 4, and then I will discuss in that video what will be my new baseline and why. I have made a selection as to what build I'm going to use for my baseline going forward, and I think there's good reason for it. So I'll discuss that in my next video as well. Thanks everyone for watching. I am now going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody. I will talk to you soon.